Now we are going to get into the sermon today. So this morning, we're finishing our series on the Sermon on the Mount. We've been in the series for right after Easter, we started this series, so it's been almost 2 months. We've been studying this amazing sermon taught by Jesus. Right, this most popular sermon probably ever preached, taught by Jesus. And we've been studying what it means for our lives. This sermon preached by Jesus was originally preached to a group of followers, a group of disciples that he had gathered together in order to live on mission with him. And this group of followers was gathered from all different walks of life, from all different stories, from all different backgrounds. And Jesus was trying to show them what a life with him looked like. So throughout these last few chapters, Jesus has taught his disciples what everyday life looks like by focusing on various values and principles that they're supposed to carry. And so we've talked about all different kinds of values, all different kinds of principles that Jesus was teaching about this way of life. And this way of life was vastly different from the religion of the day. Maybe vastly different from how some people practice religion even today. And it's vastly different from the world that we live in. See, this way of life teaches love instead of hatred. Teaches forgiveness instead of retaliation. Teaches commitment instead of lust. This is a completely different way of life. And because it's a completely different way of life, for many people it is a challenging way of life. And because it's a challenging way of life, Jesus makes a very compelling statement in Matthew 7:13-14. Jesus states, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." In this passage, Jesus makes it abundantly clear that there's only two roads. One of the roads is wide, and a lot of people enter that road. But the end of that road is destruction. But the other road is narrow, and only a few enter that road. But it leads to life. And this is illustrative of the reality of the kingdom that Jesus is inviting his followers into. Because this kingdom is narrow. It is challenging. And there's only a few people who choose to enter that road. There's a lot of people who hear about Jesus, who hear about the call to follow Jesus. And at first they say, okay, yeah, I'm in. But once they realize that that road is difficult, that road is challenging, they don't want to take that road anymore. They want to go a completely different way. And throughout this Sermon on the Mount, we have seen that these two roads stand at two opposite ends of the spectrum. But the reality also at play here is that the call of Jesus leads to life. It's a road that can be extremely difficult and comes with a high cost. But it's a road that gives us true life, true satisfaction. And as Jesus continues to preach the sermon, this seems to be his final point of the sermon. There will be people who choose him, and there will be people who don't. But we have to come to a moment in our lives. We all come to a moment in our lives where we decide, will I follow Jesus or will I not? We all have to make that individual decision for ourselves, whether we will follow Jesus, whether we won't. And Matthew 7:21-29 is going to tell us a little bit about why you should seek to follow Jesus. And so we're going to open up our Bibles to Matthew 7, 21 to 29, and read that this morning. It says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.' Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. And so as Jesus begins, he begins by talking about the difference between true disciples and false disciples. And he begins to make a clear distinction between the two. The first statement that Jesus makes is that it is not necessarily those who say, "Lord, Lord," who will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, I believe this is a prerequisite to entering into the kingdom of heaven. See, when I was in college, we had to take these different classes. And I would try and sign up for these classes. And they would say, "No, you don't have the prerequisite to sign up for that class, so you can't enter into that class yet." I'm like, "Why? Just let me in the class." But there's these classes that you have to take before in order to do it in succession, in a certain order. And so I believe the prerequisite is that we have to acknowledge that Jesus is Lord. This must be the starting place for each disciple. We must recognize, believe, and state that Jesus is Lord. This is the beginning of understanding who Jesus is. We have to understand that Jesus is God in human flesh. You have to believe that to be a disciple. But just acknowledging and even stating that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is God, I don't think is enough to be saved. Because it's one thing to acknowledge and state that Jesus is Lord, but it's a completely different thing to give your life over to him as the Lord of your life. See, there's a lot of people that believe that Jesus is God. There's a lot of people. Even in our community, I would say there's a lot of people who believe that Jesus is God. But when it comes to living life for Jesus, they don't want to give their lives over to him. And I think that's a part of the culture that we live in. We live in a culture where a lot of people do have a nominal level of faith. Where they say, "Yeah, I believe those things." You ask people, "Oh, are you a Christian?" "Yeah, I'm a Christian." "Well, why are you a Christian?" "Oh, because I believe this." But do you really allow that truth to shape your life? And I think about this, and I think sometimes it's because of the way Christians view evangelism that a lot of people are like this. See, in our modern time period, many people go out into the streets and evangelize and talk and share the gospel. Or maybe they go on a megaphone at big old rallies and big old games, and they start to talk about Jesus. And they start to talk about Jesus until somebody that they're talking to acknowledges that Jesus is Lord. And when they hear those words, when they hear somebody say that Jesus is Lord, they're like, okay, my job here is done. But they don't take the time to really show that person what it means to live for Jesus. And what I'm not saying this morning, don't hear me saying this, is that the life you live or the good things that you do save you. Only Jesus saves you. Only what Jesus did on the cross, and that he defeated death by resurrecting. That's the work that saves you. But I would argue that it's not life lived in a certain way that saves somebody, but somebody that is saved will live life in a certain way. Because there are people that can say, Lord, Lord, but their lives reveal if they really believe that Jesus is Lord. Their lives reveal what they truly believe about who Jesus is and what Jesus means to them. Because if somebody truly believes that Jesus is Lord, and their hearts really are set on Jesus being Lord, their lives will reflect that. This goes back to the idea that we've talked about throughout this sermon on the Mount, that discipleship starts in the heart. It doesn't start with outward actions. It starts with our hearts being set on Christ and being transformed by Christ. And as our hearts begin to truly desire Christ, one begins to give their life over to Christ. As one begins to spend time in intimate connection with the Lord, getting to know him personally, I believe that they reflect and they begin to want to do the will of the Father. Because when you know Christ and when you're spending time with Christ, your life begins to want to do what Christ wants you to do. But as we continue in Jesus' statements here, we see that it's not merely doing good things for Christ that allows somebody to enter into heaven. Jesus says that on the last day, there will be people that come to him and try and tell him, didn't we do all these good things for you? There will be people that tell him, didn't we prophesy? Didn't we drive out demons? Didn't we perform many miracles? In your name, Jesus, we did all this good stuff for you. And Jesus will say, depart from me. I never knew you. See, we can spend our whole lives doing good things for Jesus and never get to know Jesus. We can spend our whole lives going to church and never know Jesus. We can spend our whole lives serving Jesus and never know Jesus. I think we can even spend our lives reading the Bible and never know Jesus intimately. See, the word know here is different than know in the English language. We've talked about this word know before, but it's not a head knowledge. See, sometimes we know facts. We know historical facts. We know how to solve math problems. We know trivia question answers. This isn't the know that Jesus is talking about. The word know in the original language was an intimate kind of know. A very personal kind of know. A know where you spent time connecting with that person. It is this kind of no that Jesus says that these people were lacking with him. See, they had done all these good things for Jesus, but they didn't know Jesus. And I'm more convinced today that more than Jesus wants us to do for him, Jesus wants us to know him. See, I believe Jesus wants us to serve him, wants us to live life with him, wants us to do good things for him. But I'm more convinced that Jesus just wants us. That Jesus just wants relationship with us. And so it's my prayer. As a pastor, it's my prayer for myself. May I never get so caught up in the busyness of life, in the busyness of doing things for God, that I don't have time to spend with God. See, in our lives, we could try to be the greatest fathers. We could try to be the greatest mothers. We could try to be great at our jobs. We could try to be the greatest spouses. And we could spend our whole lives doing that. Or we can know Jesus and allow knowing Jesus to shape us into those kind of people. See, Jesus wants to shape us into those kind of people. Jesus wants us to hear these words and to put them into practice. In fact, it's so important that Jesus continues to talk about it as he concludes the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 7:24, Jesus says that those who hear these words of his and put them into practice are like a wise man who built his house on the rock. See, throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught so many different lessons about life. So many different truths. But it was up to those people listening if they were going to put these words into practice. Because many of you who are parents know that you could tell your kids things to do, but they may never put them into practice. Sorry, Mom. But throughout this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has taught lessons. And as he's taught these applicable lessons, he desires them to be put into practice. And these applicable lessons are supposed to be what our foundation for our lives, what set a foundation for our lives. And Jesus says that the foundation will be a secure foundation that will withstand the storm. Because as I've grown up, I've realized it's not whether or not the storm will come. The storm comes. Difficult, challenging, hard times come. We've all been there. We've all faced despair. We've all faced darkness. We've all felt sometimes hopeless. But in the storm, the ones who stand are the ones who built their foundation on the Lord. And we see this in culture. We see this in culture where people will build their foundation on fame. And then this new cancel culture thing will happen where they say one thing and their whole fame is stripped away and they don't know what to do with themselves. Or we've seen this with people who build money and who build empires. And some of the celebrities who have the most money are the saddest celebrities. Because when the storm comes, they don't have that solid foundation. See, the storm will come. But if we build our lives on Jesus, if we set that foundation of our lives on Jesus, we have something that will never be taken away from us. See, in life, a lot of things can be taken away from us. Everything can be taken away from you. Your family can be taken away from you. Your job can be taken away from you. Your money can be taken away from you. Your status can be taken away from you. But if you live in relationship with Jesus, that will never be taken from you. Because Jesus says these words, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so in our lives, if we build the foundation on Jesus, he will never leave us nor forsake us. And so that foundation will stay secure. That foundation will stay steady. And that's why it says Jesus is the rock. And so the challenge is, what will you do with the words that you've heard? Because in this passage, it says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. And then it says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice. And see, both of these groups of people heard Jesus' words. It's not everyone who hears these words of mine and then everyone who doesn't hear these words of mine. Both these groups of people heard Jesus' words. But they had to come to a moment where they decided, okay, what am I going to do with these words? Am I going to put these words into practice? And see, we can know Scripture, but if we're not putting Scripture into practice, if we're not allowing this to be what shapes our lives, what instructs our lives, we're not building our houses on the foundation. And so we need to hear these words, and as we hear these words, put them into practice. And so throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has taught these different lessons. Jesus has taught these things. And verse 28 tells us, when Jesus had finished these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. This was the crowd's reaction when they heard the words of Jesus. They were amazed at his teaching. And out of their amazement, they realized that there was something vastly different from him and the religious teachers of the day. This is the last thing that the chapters on the Sermon on the Mount tells us. These crowds realized that Jesus taught as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law. They realized that Jesus had a different kind of authority. And because of what Jesus taught, they realized there was something different about him. And as we finish the Sermon on the Mount, I want to ask us all to reflect on something. Throughout this Sermon on the Mount, we've heard different lessons taught about Jesus. But if we don't take the time to reflect on what we've learned in the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to just let it be another passing sermon. And see, I believe that these 3 chapters, Matthew 5 to 7, are possibly and probably some of the most important words that have ever been spoken by a human being. Ever. Because this is God in human flesh telling people how they're supposed to live their lives. See, if Jesus is just another teacher, these Sermon on the Mount words hold no power. They're not even worth studying. But if we believe that Jesus is God, if we believe that Jesus is God living in human flesh, these 3 chapters are some of the most important chapters in the Bible to study. And I want us to take the time to truly reflect on these words, to truly reflect on these 3 chapters. So as we close this morning, I want us to reflect on these 3 questions, or 2 questions. And we're going to take some time to just quietly reflect, and that may be uncomfortable for some of us because we're not good with silence. But I want us to think about this. What do those 3 chapters show you about who Jesus is? And what do those 3 chapters show you about what life with Jesus is supposed to look like? So let me pray, and then we're going to just spend just a few moments in silence as we conclude this morning.